So, should the clock be too small for your plans? I pray the cosmos light the way towards a future you yourself design. And remember, the universe has a wonderful sense of humor. The trick is learning how to take a joke.
And that was it. That should have been the end. A Crack in Time finished off the series in what appeared to be the ultimate finale, but it ended up making quite a bit of money. And the higher-ups in Insomniac were like, hey, let's take another jab at this series. This is where Ratchet and Clank went into a bit of a renaissance period, to mildly put it. Sure, I wouldn't say that full Frontal Assault and All for One were bad games per se, at least based on their reception, but a loss of quality was definitely felt post A Crack in Time. In fact, these were the first Ratchet and Clank games to receive a more mixed reaction. The stories there were a lot weaker, and if you wanted to have fun with them, it was essentially required that you have at least one other player going through the game with you. Therefore, Insomniac realized that they needed to recover from this fast, which meant that they had to prove they could still make good single-player games. Enter into the Nexus, which is supposed to be an epilogue for the future trilogy, not to be confused with the cancelled 2006 project, Ratchet and Clank Nexus. Overall, I quite like it. It's very much a return to form for the Ratchet and Clank franchise. Granted, it's a little rough around the edges, but it still manages to stick the landing all things considered. So, we boot up the game and we're greeted to this flashier title screen. Okay, now I know that I've talked about this way too much with my A Crack in Time review, but what is up with the more cinematic tone for these opening segments? There was something charming about the previous games, where all they had was Ratchet fixing something or playing a game in the background while Clank looks on. Even in A Crack in Time, they had the liberty to show a little 2D model of him in the distance. But finally, with Into the Nexus, they cut him out entirely, and it's just the title of the game plastered on the screen while bombastic music plays in the background. I suppose I should bring up that around this time the Ratchet and Clank movie was in production, and perhaps in anticipation for that, Insomniac felt the need to create a more film-esque tone, for lack of a better word. However, all that being said, I'm willing to say Nexus's title screen does one thing better than A Crack in Time's, and that's the music. Yeah, it's just jamming. Well, how does the cliche go? Don't judge a book by its cover? So, the game introduces us to Vendra and Neftin Prague, two twins who are escaped convicts. Vendra is captured by the Polaris Defense Force, and considering her being a nether gives her an astronomical amount of power, she's kept in the most secure prison, while her brother is still on the loose. Cut to the present, and Ratchet, Clank, Tallman, Kronk, and Zephyr are all assigned to keep watch over her. Yeah, after being absent from A Crack in Time, Ratchet's girlfriend and her two bodyguards actually finally make a return. And this time around, Tallman feels a lot more lively compared to the past two games she was in. Whereas Tools of Destruction and Quest for Booty had her be a generic action girl with a wooden personality, Into the Nexus gives her a bit more of a sense of humor. I mean, the way they introduce her is she pretends she's choking on hologram in an attempt to scare Ratchet. Already she feels more likable than before. The game also has the liberty to carefully introduce the main antagonist, Vendra Prague, to make her seem like a credible threat. Instead of doing what Tools of Destruction did with Tachyon and introduce her right off the bat, the game instead decides to show little bits and pieces of her to make us feel intimidated. Initially, Tallman warns the duo not to confront her without Kronk and Zephyr by their side. I really like this expression she makes after Ratchet tries to reassure her they have everything under control. At first, she furrows her eyebrows in dead seriousness, only to gradually relax before turning the hologram off. This makes it feel like this is a task of urgent concern to her, almost as if we shouldn't take it lightly. Then, all of a sudden, while they were checking on her, she wakes up, and all hell breaks loose. Even while being imprisoned, she appears to have the ability to manipulate objects from a distance, as seen with how she throws Ratchet into the depths of space by opening the main door to the ship and trying to bring down an entire elevator upon him. We may not have formally met her yet, but boy can we feel the depth of her power. And then we come face to face with her for the first time. The ominous music playing in the background while she turns around very slowly to see us gives a sort of creepy vibe that we haven't seen with other Ratchet and Clank villains. This isn't another doctor or a crime boss that is loud-mouthed and obvious with their plans. This is an enemy who is craftier and more cunning. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for her twin brother Neft in Prague, who literally makes himself known in the most obvious way possible.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
And to top it all off, the twins actually managed to kill Kronk and Zephyr. Yeah, just when it felt like Insomniac was finally reinserting these guys, the game was like, nope, and killed off two of the main characters just like that. If that isn't enough to sell you as to why these two have to be stopped, then I don't know what will. If you ask me, this is probably one of the best Ratchet and Clank intros. It creates high stakes, and it puts the heroes at a low point that they eventually need to climb out of. From a gameplay perspective, it introduces some new and old mechanics. As we're trying to flee a ship, we learn of a new way to leap onto gravity surfaces by locking onto one and slamming onto it. This is a really cool way to integrate platforming with the gravity boots. However, we never really get to use this feature ever again throughout the main story until the last planet. So, why bother introducing this concept? There's so much missed potential for interesting level designs that they could have used this for. Granted, what they chose to opt for instead is still very solid, as I'll eventually go into more detail later, but still, I feel like if they're going to introduce something this early in the game, they might as well have situations that require us to engage with it. The combat, on the other hand, is the same as it was in previous entries. However, there are some differences. First of all, I can no longer map to buttons. The trigger is more or less stuck on R1 and can no longer be placed on circle like previous entries. Strafing is now on the L1 button instead of L2. This isn't a bad per se, and over time the more I play it, the more used to it I become. However, it forces the player into a more constricted third-person shooter playstyle. Granted, going commando and up your arsenal had the option to play the game like this, but the key word is optional. They didn't force you to do it like into the Nexus. And I don't know if this was just me, but the controls became jankier with how they function. Compared to how he was in A Crack in Time, Ratchet's movement has stiffened quite a bit. So, sometimes mob fights become harder to deal with, considering that jank often got me killed from incoming blaster fire and other attacks. I wouldn't say that it's terrible or anything, since the arsenal you're given with mostly make up for such shortcomings, but still, it felt worse compared to what it once was. But anyway, we made it off the ship through some pretty cinematic gravity leaping. Apparently the Progs are working for the Thugs for Less group, and they seemingly haven't forgiven you of your previous battle with them from going commando. They try to ram you with their ship as you leap across the space debris. Fortunately for Ratchet and Clank, they're able to hop aboard a Thug's ship without being spotted and manage to hide inside of the cargo, where they land on planet Yerrick. There they contact Tallman and inform her of Kronk and Zephyr's death. It's in this scene that Into the Nexus fixes a major issue with Tools of Destruction. We finally get to see a different side to Tallman, one that is much more vulnerable compared to how she was depicted in the aforementioned game. She tells Ratchet and Clank to immediately come back to planet Igalak, because they were all that she had left. This is the first time that we actually see how her father, Max Apogee's absence is really impacting her. Without him, all she had taking care of her were Kronk and Zephyr. I feel like this aspect wasn't explored much in Tools of Destruction. We're told that Kronk and Zephyr were her guardians, but we don't really understand the depth behind their relationship. When they die in Into the Nexus, we get to see how dependent she was on them. Ultimately, without them, she feels lonely, and in a way, this parallels Clank's role to Ratchet. Essentially, they were both orphans that only had robot friends to keep them company, and without them, they had a nobody. It makes her feel like a fully fledged character and less like a stereotype. Anyway, the two of them explore what is our first planet, Yerrick. So, overall, this planet kind of gives me some old school Ratchet and Clank PS2 era vibes. There's a split path that takes you to a completely different area if you diverge in a certain section. Considering there are a huge number of enemies surrounding the area, you might think that this is a path that you're not supposed to go in and is optional. You know, like the death routes from the old Crash Bandicoot games. Well, they made it mandatory as you're supposed to go this way to retrieve the infobot that provides you access to the Battle Dome Arena, which you're required to go to in order to get the jetpack for the next planet, Psylocke. Yeah, The key word here is, again, optional. In Going Commando, after going through a jetpack section, the plumber will give you a Captain Quark action figure. Okay, seems kind of random until you return to planet Todano, where Stort Zergo gives you the armor magnetizer for it. It might not seem like much, but little things like that gave past games a special sense of exploration. With Into the Nexus, there are Rhino 7 holoplans within hidden areas and gold bolts to find, but there aren't really any planets that require you to go off the beaten path like it did with the older games, and for the one that does, they require you to do it. But the level design makes up for this major step backward. Usually, a lot of levels tend to use only one theme. When a jungle level is a jungle level, it's usually dense with a lot of trees. When a snow level is a snow level, it usually has a lot of wintry themes for the entire runtime. This was often seen in a lot of the older Ratchet and Clank levels too. However, Into the Nexus doesn't just stick to one theme. This game takes place in the Zarkov sector, which is supposed to be a haunted part in the Polaris galaxy, and you can really sense that Insomniac was trying to go in that spookier direction with the tone of each planet. Yarrick starts out in what almost looks like an abandoned city. This eventually transitions into a dark cave, which is a very distinct contrast to what was outside, and later proceeds into an abandoned orphanage, almost like something from a survival horror game. A lot of this atmospheric change reflects that of Ventra Prague, as her seemingly innocent childhood is actually marred with all sorts of trauma. It's very refreshing to see Insomniac try and use these journal entries you find in the level in order to explain Vendra's backstory. You get to hear her thoughts and emotion within her own words, which allows us to feel for her despite the fact she just killed off Kronk and Zephyr. This also develops a lot of complexity for her, as it shows that she isn't just a generic witch that wants to kill us. She has a real goal she wants to accomplish, and it allows us to have more empathy as to the reason why she does things. I also really like how it's presented as an in-game collectible instead of an exposition dump like General Azimuth's backstory, a very solid example of showing and not telling. Also, we're introduced to 2 brand new weapons in this level. Well, at least one of them is unique. The other is just this game's version of the shotgun. The Frightmare box is very much meant to be an auxiliary weapon. At least that's what it starts out as when you first buy it. It simply distracts enemies by scaring them, which draws them into attacking it, taking their attention off of you. However, if you make use of the Raritanium upgrade system, you can allow the Frightmares to attack their foes with the use of special upgrades. Once they get this ability, the weapon becomes just broken. Seriously, just combine this weapon with Mr. Zircon and even the biggest mobs will be overwhelmed. The shotgun of the franchise, the Temporal Repulsor, is basically what it sounds like. It functions exactly like every other iteration of its weapon type. It essentially has a slow rate of fire that is made up for by the strong area effect and damage output. However, the main difference with this is that it's a quantum shotgun. So when fully upgraded, it puts enemies in slow motion after they're blasted away. Not only is this very entertaining to watch, but it also prevents them from recovering too quickly after the first attack, leaving them open. And yes, as I mentioned before, the Raritanium system from Tools of Destruction comes back. It works the same as before. You upgrade certain aspects of the weapon like ammo capacity, rate of fire, and damage with Raritanium. Leveling it up enough times gives the weapon a special upgrade. Like with the Winterizer, whenever you turned enemies into snowmen, you'll get presents that turned into bolts or nanotech. There is one big difference in the sense that a good portion of these upgrades are locked away until you get your weapon to the next level via experience. So this actually incentivizes you to keep using that gun. It's a little thing, but it's a nice balancing act that Tools of Destruction didn't have. In that game, you had the potential to make your weapon overpowered at V1 since all the Raritanium upgrades would be available at the start. So congratulations Into the Nexus, for as short as you were, you managed to do something better than your fuller-length cousin. And to add to those things that Into the Nexus did better, let's talk about the Clank sections. So, Clank's gameplay has taken quite the evolution throughout the Future saga, whereas in A Crack in Time it mostly focused on solving puzzles via recordings of oneself. Into the Nexus's Clank sections had him going through a linear 2D environment while having the ability to shift gravity. The more cartoonish, watercolory art style supports the peculiar aspect of these levels. Initially, the anti-grav puzzles revolve around doing something as simple as fitting a box into a switch. However, they're able to change this up to make it harder by adding additional obstacles like mines and lava that actually make you think about how to adjust your gravity. Reaching the end of these sections require you to wake up another beast, which will chase you. You really have to think quick on your feet in order to avoid this monster and get back to the exit. Thankfully, the anti-gravity feature is maneuverable and fast enough to have Clank move at a pretty quick pace. Overall, these feel more dynamic than what A Crack in Time had. Not that A Crack in Time's Clank gameplay was bad or anything, but it reused a lot of the same elements for each puzzle. Maybe Into the Nexus' Clank sections had a lot of the same obstacles. You had to somehow navigate the mines, the moving platforms, and the lava, but the level-based nature allowed them to be presented in a different way. So that's another point for Into the Nexus. The final thing that this game introduced within this level is the Gravity Tether gadget. Basically, Ratchet fires a tether between two targets and rides it to a higher elevation. They create some interesting puzzles with these. For instance, sometimes Ratchet needs to ride multiple gravity tethers while avoiding hazards like spotlights. Sometimes their activation is timed, and he needs to race to the other side before it deactivates. They're pretty good at creating different situations with this simple gadget. The problem arises with the fact that you have to use the circle button to activate it. If they wanted to, Insomniac could have made this gadget equipable in the Quick Select menu and given you the option to remap the button to either R1 or circle. But no, instead they decided to lock it onto the latter, preventing it from being used in combat. I know this is a minor gripe, but it feels like this is a bit of an insult to the people who used a circle button to fire their weapon. I don't know, maybe that makes me too much of a filthy casual. So, Ratchet and Clank eventually catch up to Vendra and Neft in Prague, and find them using a prototype of the Dimensionator to unleash the Nethers into their realm. This is obviously bad considering the Nethers don't look like the friendliest of creatures, and appear to be out for blood. But Vendra doesn't care. After all, she's just glad to be finally reunited with her race. Their leader, though, Mr. I, cannot come through. Now, this is supposed to be the main antagonist of the game, but while we learn a lot about Vendra and grow to sympathize for her, we hardly get to know anything about Mr. I. The journal entries don't really give us much other than the fact that Mr. I was there for her in her time of loneliness, and, as later seen, he takes advantage of that in order that he might take over Ratchet's universe, so we have a justifiable reason to hate him, but still, the whole nature of the Nethers is never quite fleshed out or explored in more detail throughout the game, and I blame that on the short length. Eventually, Neftin and Vendra catch Ratchet and Clank spying on them and they're forced to flee. It's here that Captain Quark makes one of very few appearances in this game to save them. Into the Nexus is a game where the Captain seems to have the least amount of presence, maybe except for Deadlocked, and I don't know, ever since Up Your Arsenal, Captain Quark almost feels like he's being relegated to the level of NPC status. It's like they didn't know what to do with this character after the third game. Eventually, Ratchet and Clank fall to Prague's to planet Silox, where they plan to unleash Mr. I. According to Vendra, this entire city is abandoned. However, this isn't entirely true, as there's a mayor that speaks over the loudspeakers. And he has a bit of a Vermont accent, which makes me think that he's a reference to Bernie Sanders. But this game was made in 2013, and Sanders never had much recognition until 2016. So there's that. But seriously, take a listen for yourself.
If you see a ghost, please do not attempt to befriend it. Chances are, it's not so much adorable as it is murderous and evil. Thank you, and don't forget to vote Dumblebrick.
The American people are tired of women.
Silox is essentially somewhat similar to Yerrick in the sense that it gives me a lot of abandoned city vibes. However, whereas Yerrick had more of a jungle theme, because Silox is made entirely of water, it has more of a sewer environment that goes along with its more urban sensibilities. It's almost like a combination of Blackwater City and a metropolis. In fact, perhaps as an homage to the former, there are two sections where you have to flee from rising water. The first one feels almost identical to its original counterpart. You just run as fast as you can as you do some platforming to escape the flooding hallways. The second one, on the other hand, requires a bit more skill and is actually very creative in its execution. So, you're riding the jetpack and you have to get to the other side of a sewer in order to turn the water off. Basically, you have to navigate through multiple propellers before you run out of fuel. This forces you to monitor how much of it you're using so you don't empty the tank too quickly while maintaining Ratchet's head above the surface. Unlike the one in Blackwater City, this one feels a lot less random since it serves the purpose of being a skill check for using the jetpack. Also, the atmosphere is much better as well. Whereas Blackwater City had us fleeing through familiar hallways, Psylocke's version of this had us flying through some dark corridors that were pitch black. The only indication for the height of the water was the gargled screams of the Thugs for Less foes drowning. Of course, in order to get the jetpack, you need to first accomplish the Bronze Cup within the arena, which functions very much the same as to how it was depicted in previous games. If there's one difference, it's that they introduce linear hoverboot courses, where you race to the end point before time runs out, and the jetpack sections, where you have to either kill multiple enemies or a boss while using it. Both of these were very much irritating to do because the controls weren't very good when it came to using them in combat. I'll get to the hoverboots later, but fighting with the jetpack felt very awkward. I understand that since it's airborne there's a lot of floatiness involved, but it causes Ratchet to move slower compared to when he was on the ground. Therefore, he becomes an easier target to shoot at. Of course, maybe Mr. Zircon can provide some aerial support, but he only does so much to ameliorate this situation. Speaking of Zircon, I suppose now might be a good time to talk about the different weapons that this section of the game introduces. As I've hinted about earlier, Mr. Zircon basically works exactly the same as he did in his previous endeavors. He trash-talks all of his foes while providing extra firepower for Ratchet. Into the Nexus took this a step further in the creativity department by giving him a son and a mother when he's fully upgraded. It provides you with an extra layer of crowd control, which is much needed to take care of those mob fights. And surprisingly, their back-and-forth banter isn't too annoying, despite the fact that there are 3 of them now. You've also got the Nether Blades. These are similar to the Disc Blade gun and Buzz Blades. Similar to Mr. Zircon, the Nether Blades were pretty good at controlling multiple enemies. Their gimmick of bouncing off of other structures allowed them to hit enemies multiple times when only a few shots were fired. If there's one drawback, it's that the rate of fire honestly wasn't as good as their predecessor. And finally we have the Winterizer, which is probably one of the most creative weapons that Ratchet and Clank has ever conceived. It fires a beam of energy that slows enemies down for quite a bit, which eventually leads them to freezing into snowmen. All the while, Jingle Bells plays in the background. This might sound like an overtly cutesy weapon, but it's actually quite useful against bosses, believe it or not. While they don't freeze into snowmen, their health bar practically disintegrates when they come into close proximity of the beam. Seriously, for a so-called joke weapon, it's actually quite effective in unexpected ways. Plus, upgrading it via Raritanium gives it the ability to have enemies drop presents after being frozen, which rewards you with bolts and nanotech. At the end of this planet, Ratchet and Clank catch up to Neft in Prague and warn him that what he's about to do is going to rip the fabric of space and time. Nefton obviously doesn't listen, challenging Ratchet with this question.
Can you imagine seeing your kind right there? Close enough to touch, but impossible to reach.
I quite like how Ratchet's answer sort of references everything he's learned in the previous game. Even though he doesn't mention Alistair Azimuth by name, his response that wanting something too badly leads to detrimental results demonstrates the lessons he's learned from that past experience. It gives the feeling that Into the Nexus is connected to the future games, not just by name only. Prague and Ratchet engage in a boss fight, which is actually a painfully easy battle, even on the hard difficulty. Yeah, Nefton's brawn doesn't really translate into gameplay, but even after stopping him, the duo is too late to keep Vendra from letting Mr. I in with the Dimensionator. Unfortunately, he ends up capturing her and revealing that he was just using her as a pawn. What a surprise! I'm sure absolutely nobody saw this coming. I mean, maybe I shouldn't blame Vendra too much. After all, she could only see a small glimpse of Mr. I when she initially met him. He was clearly very smart in concealing his true form from her up to this point. With the barriers between their dimensions broken, the Nethers start taking over the city. Ratchet and Clank eventually find themselves cornered, but they are rescued by none other than Neft and Prague. While his hands are still stained from killing Kronk and Zephyr, it turns out all he ever wanted to do was protect Vendra and had no malicious intent towards the galaxy. This is a very unique twist that sets him apart from the other members of Ratchet's Rogues Gallery. Usually, the series has opted for villains who are just black and white in their motivations. While Chairman Drek and Gleeman Vox were interesting in the anti-consumerist themes they were trying to convey, they were very obviously malicious with little to no subtlety. Dr. Nefarious's whole shtick is to be the cliché evil villain, and the way he plays it straight is the whole charm of his personality. But for Insomniac to make a villain that is more sympathetic and not exactly having his intentions set on galactic domination is very refreshing. For as much as we hate the pain he inflicted on Talwyn by killing her beloved robot bodyguards, we really can't be too mad at him because he really didn't know much else besides trying to protect Vendra. After all the harassment they went through at the orphanage, the twins are only familiar with despair and suffering, and their actions were a response to that. Into the Nexus may be a short game, but it still manages to fit a lot of character development within its minuscule length. So the duo flee to planet Thram in order to track down Neft in Prague. There they run into an ever-so-familiar character.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man.
I've complained before that I just don't get why Insomniac is so afraid to use different NPCs, but I really cannot understand why Insomniac constantly likes to use the smuggler character. He's like the Pedro Pascal of the Ratchet and Clank series. He's overused, and there's really nothing too special about him. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think he's a fan-favorite character. Anyway, he tasks us with finding Gargathon horns in the swamp. Yes, this is another planet where we have an open world, and we need to collect a certain number of items to trade in for something. In this case, it's the hoverboots. One Reddit post asked people to rank the worst planets from this game, and as you could see, most people thought that Thram was the worst. And I just don't see why. This planet essentially functioned in the same exact way as Siberius from Going Commando or the Aquatos sewers from Up Your Arsenal. Sure, maybe if I have a complaint, I will say that most of the planet looks very much the same, and it can sometimes be hard to figure out where you are, but Siberius and Aquatos also had a lot of samey-looking environments too. I might also say that this level goes a step further by adding additional side content besides looking for the Gargathon horns, such as searching for the keys to unlock the huge safe in the middle of the swamp, which frees the plumber. These are found by completing battery bot puzzles. Unlike the combat encounters, which had you fighting head-on, these puzzles force you to memorize the layout of the level in order to find a battery bot and get back to the required target, so it provides a bit of a break from the running and gunning gameplay. Also, if you find all the Rhino Hollow plans, the plumber gives you the Rhino 7 in return for releasing him from the safe. Really? Worst planet from Into the Nexus? I don't think so. Going back to the story, Ratchet and Clank track down Neft in Prague's hiding place, and he asks them to steal the real Dimensionator from the museum on Igalac, as the other one was simply a crude replica. Ratchet then questions why Neft in Prague is doing all of this, considering that Vendra is pretty horrible to him. He replies that she wasn't always like this, and she was just dealing with not being able to be reunited with the Nethers. Again, I really appreciate how they're trying to depict Vendra as a more sympathetic villain. There's an explanation behind why she isn't thinking rationally, and in a way, it's a goal that Ratchet could sympathize with, considering he never managed to find his own race as well. So Nefton promises to turn himself in after Ratchet and Clank steal the real Dimensionator to bring the Nethers back to their original dimension. They shake on it, with Neft in Prague essentially crushing Ratchet's hand. How can he hold a blaster like that? And the duo heads back to the museum in Meridian City to complete the task. Compared to Tools of Destruction, Meridian City makes a lot of major improvements. In Tools, all you had was the city to walk around in. Into the Nexus expands upon this by not only allowing you to explore the urban outskirts, but the museum as well. This isn't as cool as the Insomniac Museum, which displayed a lot of the development processes that the games went through. However, there's something charming about being able to listen to a tour guide explain all the past adventures that Ratchet and Clank have been on. They actually went out of their way to try to make it somewhat interactive. For instance, you get to fight an actual functioning bio-obliterator. Like, this is what they should have done for the ending of Ratchet 3, instead of having you fight against that mech suit Dr. Nefarious was in. And if you go in a little secret entranceway, you get an exhibit that's dedicated to Dan Johnson, a former Insomniac employee that tragically died due to bone cancer and was paid homage to ever since Size Matters. It's nice of them to add a little Easter egg like that. Ratchet and Clank eventually reached a Dimensionator and prepare to hand it over to Neft and Prague. Unfortunately, the Nethers decide that such moment was the perfect time to strike. Thus, the final battle commences. You may have noticed that I've stopped talking about the weapons all of a sudden, and that's because the rest of the arsenal isn't really worth mentioning in my eyes. You've got the Plasma Striker, which is identical to how it was in A Crack in Time. The Warmonger is this game's missile launcher. The Vortex Grenade works exactly like the Rift Inducer 5000, except it behaves more like a magnet that pulls enemies in, instead of outright vaporizing them in a black hole. The Nether Beast is a unique one considering that it allows Ratchet to actually use the Nethers against his foes, in a way giving them a taste of their own medicine, but I don't know. I feel like there was some missed potential for this weapon to be like an Agents of Doom recreation, in which they actually assisted you in combat instead of just appearing for 1 second and chopping your enemies, but oh well, what can you do? So the game pretty much ends with a final boss fight against Mr. I. Once he's taken out of commission, Neft and Prague uses the Dimensionator to rescue Vendra and send Mr. I back to the Netherverse. From there, Neftin was true to his word and, to the disbelief of Vendra, turns himself and his sister into custody. From there, the main duo both set themselves down in a museum, and Clank asks Ratchet if there had ever been an instance that he wanted to use the Dimensionator to go back and find the other Lombaxes, especially in light of the ordeal they'd gone through with Vendra Prague. He replies there was a time that without hesitation he would have done so, but he feels that there are more important things for him to focus on, implying that his girlfriend Talwyn fills that void within his heart. This is kind of the same conclusion that he came to in A Crack in Time when he decided that the past stays where it is, and seeing how insane such ambitions made people like Vendra Prague solidifies his decision to not pursue that. He chooses to focus on what's in the present, understanding that people like Talwyn would be completely alone without his presence, since without Krunk and Zephyr, she literally has nobody. It's a nice finale that feels like it just completely closes the book for the future saga. At least, that's what I would have said if they didn't have that extra clip of Clank taking the Dimensionator. What he does with it, well, stay tuned for Rift Apart. But putting that little unsatisfying detail aside, does Into the Nexus succeed on its own merit? I'd say pretty much yes. The arsenal, while small compared to previous entries, still manages to mostly be very fun and explosive to use. The level design is solid with its use of different environments, so it doesn't feel too repetitive or bland to go through. The villains have a unique twist from other Ratchet and Clank antagonists in the sense that the story makes you feel more empathy for their motivations, which is a departure from the more conventional black and white evil genius stereotypes of past entries. Honestly, if there's one thing holding it back, it's that the short length prevents certain plot points from being built upon more, like the Netherverse and Avengers' relationship with Mr. I, and the fact that they felt the need to leave this on a cliffhanger when they had the potential to wrap up this series kind of leaves a bittersweet taste in my mouth. Other than that, Into the Nexus is truly as defined of a Ratchet and Clank game as they get. It's basically the embodiment of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and while some may say that it feels like the formula is getting stale, I disagree. The reason the Ratchet and Clank games have been so successful is because they've stuck to the same working mechanics while making little innovations here and there to make it feel fresh. And Into the Nexus is no deviation from that philosophy. It's a short but sweet epilogue that accomplishes what it sets out to do.